I think having a clarity about one's personal values, one's personal kind of ethical North Star, so that you can lead with integrity is absolutely fundamental for all of this. And I think having that capacity to be able to engage and to be able to get insights from all parts of the organization that you're leading is so important.
Today we're hearing from Professor David Grayson, Chair of the Institute of Business Ethics, co-host of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast, and Emeritus Professor of Corporate Responsibility. Welcome to Insights from the Coalface, elevating leadership beyond the boardroom. I'm Sarah Cole, a former solicitor turned life coach and founder of Cole Forums, a peer support network for CEOs and General Counsel. This podcast is your exclusive access to high-trust conversation designed to inspire and empower leaders like you to thrive not just professionally but personally. In each episode, we'll delve into the challenges and triumphs of leadership, offering actionable insights and strategies to help you navigate complexity, foster resilience, and achieve authentic growth. Let's get started, and together we'll take your leadership beyond the boardroom. Our guest today is Professor David Grayson CBE, co-author of the Sustainable Business Handbook 2022 and board member of Baiduri Bank Group. David is a global thought leader on the role of business in society. He's written 10 books on the topic, and he co-hosts All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. He was Professor of Corporate Responsibility at Cranfield University School of Management from 2007 to 2017 and is now Emeritus Professor. David is currently chair of the Institute of Business Ethics. He's advised businesses, responsible business coalitions, and international institutions like the European Union and the OECD. He is a companion of the Chartered Management Institute and has a Lifetime Achievement Award from Reuters Sustainable Business. David has chaired a number of social enterprises, charities, quangos, and government task forces, and has served on a range of public, private, and third sector boards and advisory boards. He was awarded an OBE for his services to business in 1994 and a CBE for his services to disability in 1999. Welcome, Professor David Grayson. So lovely of you to join us. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share some thoughts with us. I'm really interested, David, about how you even got into this space. That's what I'm keen to learn.
Oh gosh, where do we start, Sarah? So I suppose one really formative experience is that on my 11th birthday, I very nearly died. It turns out I had what was a very life-threatening bone disease, which took a while to be identified. And it was touch and go, by all accounts, for a few days as to whether I would live or die. And then the doctor said if he does survive, he probably won't ever walk again. Happily, obviously, the medics were a little bit off on both counts. But that was a very formative experience. And I spent the following 9 months in and out of hospital in what was known as a hip spiker, which was plaster of Paris from up at the top of the chest down to the little toes with some strategic holes. And I changed enormously, as you can imagine, during that time. And I suppose one of the changes is that when you've come that close to death, then if you're lucky enough to get a second chance, you think, I better do something with this. So I think I started from quite a young age to feel I had to justify my time on God's earth. And then I got very interested as a teenager in politics and in campaigning, and I ran several local campaigns in the village in northeast Derbyshire, just outside Sheffield, where I was born and grew up. And then I was fortunate enough after Cambridge to win a scholarship to go to the Free University of Brussels, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and to do a master's in how what we would now call the European Union institutions work. We had to do a whole series of different modules, most of which weren't taught by academics, happily, but by people who were running the European Commission or in the International Atomic Energy Agency and so on. And one of the best courses was by a wonderful Belgian, Pierre Wathelet, who ran much of the European Social Fund. And this was in the late 1970s. And we all had to write a thesis for him. And my paper was all about how all of the European structural funds would have to shift in the 1980s to cope with all of the declining industries that Europe had in its portfolio: basic steelmaking, shipbuilding, coal mining, heavy engineering, basic chemical manufacturing, and so on. And at the end of my year in Brussels, which is a fantastic year, did get the masters somehow, even though the course was meant to be taught en français and my command of the French language is not very good. But after the year, I went to work for Procter & Gamble, the big marketing company in Newcastle, the northeast of England. And as I started to get my bearings in the northeast, and I looked around and what was the economy and the society in which I was suddenly living: coal mining, heavy engineering, basic chemical manufacturing, shipbuilding, and so on. And I started talking to people in the trade unions and the CBI and the political parties and the local government and so on in my spare time, and discovered that nobody was really thinking very much about where the new jobs were going to come from. And of course, ripe old age of 22, 23, 24, you think you've got the answers. And so with a colleague, I quit my job and we set up something called Project Northeast, which we didn't know at the time. It was not any vocabulary like it at the time, but it was and is a social enterprise. And it pioneered some ideas about public-private community partnership and helping young people to create their own jobs and to develop new skills for what in 1980 we identified as the coming IT revolution, and so on and so forth. And so that's how I got into all of this. And I'm delighted to have spent my entire working life in this field.
What fascinates me about that is, why Procter and Gamble? Why a big marketing? I mean, it's quite a leap, isn't it?
So it was a leap from studying law in Cambridge and the politics and economics of the European communities, as it was then known, in Brussels, to go into marketing management. But at the time, I thought I wanted to become an elected politician, and I didn't think there were enough people with business experience and management experience in politics at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s. And so that was the game plan. And they also offered me a job. And it was one of those kind of weird quirks of fate.
And I think it kind of explains a very prevalent theme in everything that I've read that you've written, which is a very practical approach, which, forgive me, academics usually, although they may touch on that, don't seem to have the deep understanding that you do of the steps or the practical implications of those steps.
I think most of my academic colleagues would say, but David's not really an academic. And I'm not really an academic. I mean, I've become maybe a kind of semi-house trained one over the years, but my main experiences are very much on the front line, very, very practitioner orientated. And I always joke that I was a very late developer in terms of management education. I was already north of 50 when I was headhunted to apply for the Cranfield job, and I was nearly 52 by the time I actually started. I was appointed to set up a new centre for responsible business in the Cranfield School of Management. And because they'd advertised that the new centre would also involve a new chair in corporate responsibility, they actually made me a professor, even though I'm one of those very rare professors who doesn't have a PhD. I don't boast about that. I reflect on the fact I'm a huge admirer of everyone who achieves the status of getting a doctorate and all the hard work that goes into it. But Cranfield essentially said, look, you've been working in this field for a quarter century, you've written books on the topic and so on. We will take that into account. So my first few months in Cranfield, people would say, "Good morning, Professor," and I would be looking around to see who they were talking to because I didn't think they were possibly talking to me.
During your tenure at Cranfield School of Management, did you observe quite a few shifts, if you like, in how business education addresses topics like sustainability?
Huge, and it was a very exciting time because just before I went to Cranfield, there had been a group of business leaders and professors in some of the leading business schools across Europe who had come together in a dialogue organized by an organization called CSR Europe. And that led to the establishment of what was originally called the European Academy of Business and Society. Then they dropped the European bit and went more international still. And the early years of ARBIS were really very exciting, kind of dynamic startup mode where a number of passionate advocates in a number of the leading business schools in INSEAD, London Business School was a partner at the beginning. Cranfield was one of the founding partners before I ever thought of becoming a professor. And these organizations recognized that the world was fundamentally changing, and in particular, what we would now call broadly sustainable development and sustainable business was going to be a much bigger part of the future. Indeed, many of us would say was absolutely core to future business success. And what did that mean in terms of the research, the teaching, the advisory work that business schools did, and how business schools, as entities themselves, as organizations themselves, would have to change dramatically in order to really understand and to be able to teach and advise on these new developments with credibility and authority. So I went to Cranfield at a time when there was a real ferment of ideas and new practices emerging in a number of the leading business schools. And I was very privileged to be part of that network even before I went to Cranfield, being involved in some of the early conversations around the European Academy of Business and Society, and also some British conversations with business schools and business leaders that were facilitated by Business in the Community, which I still retained an affiliation with, even though I'd long since left full-time work with Business in the Community. And so I had that wonderful opportunity, that network of individuals and organizations who were already interested in what are we going to teach in business schools? How is this going to shift massively? Because remember, for decades, business schools across the world have basically taught the purpose of business is maximizing shareholder value. End of story, full stop. And so we really had to challenge that Milton Friedman doctrine. And I use the word doctrine because I think towards the later years it had become something of a dogma, and suggest how the world was fundamentally different to when Milton Friedman had been writing his famous treatise in 1962 originally, and then more popularly in 1970. So, yes, I've seen huge changes. I've seen huge changes in research, the amount of research that's going on in business schools around sustainable business. Fundamental shifts in teaching, still not enough, of course. And a lot of my colleagues across the world in business schools who advise businesses are now doing so with the sustainable, responsible business, ethical business lens.
Thinking around, I can see how fired you're up around that topic. It's wonderful to see. Thinking around how academic institutions prepare future leaders, because thinking of my audience are leaders. How do you fire up your students, if you like, to get them prioritizing corporate responsibility and thinking around these issues?
So one of the things that Cranfield has done, And I can claim absolutely no responsibility for this at all. It was the initiative of one of my successors, Dr. Rosina Watson, who herself has an interesting background because she too had worked in business and then later in her career came to Cranfield to do a doctorate and then joined the faculty of Cranfield. Rosina persuaded the university authorities to make sustainable business and how you lead sustainable business not just a core course of our revamped MBA, Master of Business Administration program at Cranfield, but also that it should be taught in the first month of the executive MBA. So really creating a new foundation for the revamped executive MBA. And another thing that Rosina initiated, which I think was a really valuable idea, it sounds so simple, and yet it really, I think, helped the incoming exec MBA students to be in the right frame of mind when they came into the classroom for the first leading sustainable business sessions. We asked them before they came to that module to go and talk to the most senior person they could get in their organization. And we gave them a series of suggested interview questions as a kind of guide about their own organization's approach to sustainability, what it meant in their organization, how they were organizing. Did they have a head of sustainability or chief sustainability officer or director of sustainability, etc.? What were the big challenges that the organization was facing? Where were the investment opportunities and so on? And invariably, and I've read now over several years, maybe 400 or 500 of these reports before each incoming exec MBA group. I've finished now teaching on that program, but it was really interesting. Those reports, how many times they talked about, gosh, I had no idea our organization was doing so much on this topic. I didn't realize that this was affecting this strategy. And of course, now I understand how this is a constraint for us if we don't get this right. You know, whether that's somebody working for a company like Coca-Cola or Diageo or another company that uses a lot of water, talking about we've had to now think about what's our strategy for our operations in water-stressed conditions, or for people working for a law firm or for a big accountancy firm or a big management consultancy, thinking about what's our KYC, our know your customer, know your client onboarding processes, and are we really being rigorous enough in terms of thinking about what's our criteria for taking on new clients for our professional services firm. So that, I think, is a really valuable innovation in terms of starting from where the students and their organizations are at. I think the other thing from my experience, and this again is not an original insight at all, I mean, Harvard have been doing this for decades, but the value of teaching cases to bring to life the challenges that real life managers and leaders face. And I tried it. In the end, I think wrote around 30 business school teaching cases. The very first one won an international prize. I should have quit after that first one because none of the others were ever as successful. The very first one was on Innocent, the fruit smoothies business, very early days of Innocent. And I was a member of a responsible business advisory board for Innocent before I went to Cranfield. So I had some insights and I had some really good connections to the founders at the time. So the Innocent teaching case was good, but inadvertently I found that I was trying to particularly find that the focus of some of the teaching cases could be on people who weren't much older than the students that I was using the teaching case with. Like, guys, this could be you in a very short time horizon.
Very inspirational for the students. And it strikes me that those questions you're asking aren't a million miles from the questions you're asking in your book, all in and you were putting out there to the companies to really get a feel for where they were at. And one of the things I wanted to quote to you back, I absolutely love in All In, is you say that Keith Weeds from Unilever is the chief marketing officer there. Riley commented, people often say to me, what is the business case for sustainability? And I always answer, I'd love to see the business case for the alternative. I love that quote because isn't that it in a nutshell? Where we're at. And on that business case perspective, do you think there are still hurdles for business owners in overcoming those business needs and balancing them against what we know it needs to be done?
Yes. So I think it would be naive in the extreme to pretend that the argument is over. The argument has been won. You've only got to open the morning newspapers to see some of the ongoing debates and challenges. I'm pleased you liked All In. All In was every book that I've done has been great fun, and most of them I've had the privilege of working with fantastic co-authors. But All In was a special favorite because it was the first book I did with two Canadian colleagues, Chris Coulter, who runs an organization called GlobeScan, and Mark Lee, who now runs the ERM Sustainability Institute. And Chris and Mark and I had the privilege of interviewing maybe 40, 50 senior business leaders across the world. We had phenomenal access. And people like Paul Polman, he gave us 2 hours of his time in the middle of his holiday one summer. And virtually every line that he was giving us, I was thinking, gosh, that's an amazing quote and what have you. But about 3/4 of the way through, he sort of paused and said, I hope I'm giving you something that could be useful. And I'm thinking, my goodness, this is stuff. And really, it was really authentic and so on. And he was one of I'd say, a huge number of business leaders who were incredibly generous with their time and insights. And we did try to capture what business leaders around the world, not just in developed economies, but in some of the really fast-growing economies in South America, and particularly in Asia, are experiencing. So I think clearly one of the questions is around time horizons. And this is where, of course, if you are running a family business, you're running a business which is privately owned, maybe owned by a foundation, family office, whatever. I think they have some huge advantages, particularly if it's a third, fourth, fifth generation family business. They have huge advantages in terms of instinctively having a longer time horizon. And one of our big challenges, and I was chairing a conference in London last week about culture and conduct in the financial services sector. And one of the discussions we were having was about the contrast in different types of when we talk about, but the shareholders want this or that. But shareholders are not, one amorphous mass. You and I are almost certainly shareholders because we, I'm sure, have some pension funds and maybe the occasional ISA and so on and so forth. So we are shareholders, and like the great majority of ordinary folk, we probably aren't moving our shares around every hour or every day or what have you. We are genuinely shareholders, and our interests, my interest is something rather older than you, Sarah, but my interests are for patient building up of funds for my eventual, if I can use a naughty word, retirement. A long time away. But the point I'm making in all seriousness is that we're long-term shareholders. We're not share speculators who are just building up a position, pushing for some short-term cost savings, maybe at the expense of R&D, market research, advertising to develop new products, new markets, which will build long-term sustainable profit for the business and help to grow the business for the longer term. Which is why when we wrote our book, All In, The Future of Business Leadership, we talked about sustainable business as being about giving you the best chance of continuing the business into the indefinite future. And I think time horizons, and of course it's the explanation for the Milton Friedman theory, etc., it's all about time horizons.
Staying with All In just for the moment, what I think might be of interest to those listening is you discuss the attributes of high impact corporate sustainability leadership. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little on the attributes that you noted and their significance.
So it's important, I think, to stress that the origins of All In were 20 years of annual surveys, the GlobeScan Sustainability Annual Leaders Survey. And this survey involves several hundred, at its peak, I think, nearly 1,000 experts in sustainable business around the world, in businesses, in civil society, in the media, in academia, few in regulatory organizations, and so on. And so this is a perception survey. It's if you like, collective intelligence of the informed crowd. And the questions that this GlobeScan Sustainability Leaders Survey were asking over 20 years with these experts was the basis for what we produced in All In. So it wasn't Chris and Mark and I sitting down in some darkened rooms and little bit of finger in the air or on the proverbial whiteboard mapping what we thought. That might have been marginally interesting to a few folk. But the important thing was this was based on the analysis of hundreds of leading experts in sustainable business from within business and stakeholders of business from around the world over 20 years. And from that, we pulled out a number of what we thought were the core attributes that we then tested in these detailed interviews with senior business figures, CEOs, CFOs, chief sustainability officers, etc., in businesses around the world. So the first core attribute was about, is this business really purpose-led? And there's been a sort of outpouring of ideas about purpose in the last few years. And I think some people have not quite got it right. And they thought purpose, so that's having some nice words, wordsmith by PR and comms folk, and we can put on our website and we can put in our annual report and it will be, sounds really good. The crucial thing, and organizations like Blueprint for Better Business have so got this right, is about, is the business really purpose-led? And does it drive down and inform board decisions? Does it inform management decisions? Does it become the instinctive go-to point? So is it authentic? Is it practical? Is it inspiring? So that was the very first attribute. But purpose-led requires also then having execution of that purpose in terms of a clear strategy. I think Blueprint for Better Business, for instance, is so right about all of this. It must be purpose-led, infusing decision-making through the organization. Second attribute is about strategy, giving effect to the purpose. And are we then having the strategy really being influenced by commitments to sustainability? A little bit like when I was a kid, you used to go to the seaside and you get a stick of rock. We shouldn't do it nowadays, of course, for the teeth, but in those days, we didn't know better. Rather like Blackpool or Skegness or somewhere going through the stick of rock is sustainability going through the strategy of the organization. But we also know, third attribute, what eats strategy for breakfast every day, and that's organizational culture. And I think until maybe 10 years ago, I hadn't given anywhere near enough attention to the question about organizational culture as one of the really critical things that determines whether an organization will be successful or not in embedding sustainability, embedding responsibility, being a really truly ethical business, doing business with integrity or not. So culture becomes a really critical attribute that we talk about in All In, and then further in our follow-up book, The Sustainable Business Handbook. And then we also identified collaboration as one of the critical ways of being able to achieve more than you can possibly do on your own. Spelt out for us so incredibly powerfully by Kathleen McLaughlin, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Walmart. Think, even a big global business like Walmart can only move the dial just marginally on its own without engaging its supply chain and its sector and so on. And this idea of collaboration as a critical attribute. And then we also talked about the potential then to amplify with advocacy and particularly collaborative advocacy. So where a number of companies come together and talk about the importance of pro-sustainable development policies, taxes, subsidies, etc.
And I think I would completely agree that the product of bringing people together who are peers and working towards the same goal is so much more powerful. And I think you even touched on it back in 2004 in your corporate social opportunity book that you wrote.
Gosh, you've really been doing your homework.
I try, David. But I think you did touch on it even then, the collaborative aspect at least.
Yeah, and that's not surprising, remember, because I spent hugely formative decade in business in the community from the very early stages of business in the community as a network of businesses interested in what are our responsibilities for our social and environmental and economic impacts. How do we minimize our negative impacts? How do we maximize our positive impacts? So I was really schooled by people like Stephen O'Brien and Julia Cleverden and so on in the emerging ideas of public-private community partnership. And indeed, that's what we built Project Northeast on. It was all about public-private community partnership.
And I loved your VUCA reference that you made in All In because, and I wondered how that came about because it's a military term, isn't it?
It is. And for anyone who's not come across this idea that we live in a VUCA world, which is, so it stands for V for volatile, U for uncertain, C for complex, and A for ambiguous. And yes, it started in the American military in the 1960s or 70s. And it really became more popular, I think, in management speak post-millennium. And it does reflect the fact that sort of the old ideas of linear economy and so on are all deeply in the past. And if we thought we were living in a VUCA world when we wrote All In back in 2017, 2018, my goodness, 8 years on, it's even more of a VUCA world.
So thinking of this VUCA world and I'm drawing some threads from what you've just said, I saw that in 2024 there was a kind of mass exodus, or certainly the biggest exodus of CEOs from business that we've seen since tracking began, at least in 2002. And I was thinking around the whole premise of purpose and culture and all of the things that we now have come to understand are really important in a high-performing company, and I mean on lots of metrics, not just profitability. Why do you think that could be? Drawing from all your experience and the various, and I know you've had some amazing podcast conversations with lots of people, apart from your interviews in the book. Why do you think that could be happening? Do you think it's a purpose issue or multiple issues?
I think it's a multiple set of causes. The challenges now of being the CEO, the buck stops here big time, particularly if you're running an international company, but even if you're running a small business, you've got so many different things to be thinking about. You've had cash flow during the pandemic and the lockdown of the global economy. You've had, how do I cope with huge interruptions to my global supply chains? People suddenly realize that the ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal can cause blockages for months afterwards in terms of global supply chains. Or, my goodness, what's this Yemeni civil war that suddenly means that my product coming from China is now 3 months late, or what have you? Let alone all the conventional things about how do I satisfy my customers? How do I cope with a cost of living crisis? How do I start to think about leading in a 4 or 5 generation workplace that now is becoming increasingly common? How do I cope with all of these pressures and counter pressures around what's the obligations of my company in relation to climate change and CO2 emissions and equivalents and so on? What's material to my business if I'm operating in any way inside the European Union, even if I'm headquartered in the UK? Am I going to be liable for the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, etc., etc., etc.? I think the complexities of running a modern business are now huge, and with CEOs talking about working 80-hour weeks and the relentless pace of it, then I think the dangers for burnout. I mean, CEOs are human beings too.
And it loops back, I think, obviously your latest book, The Sustainable Business Handbook and a Guide to Becoming More Innovative, Resilient and Successful. Just dwelling on the resilience aspect of that book, that ties in, doesn't it, to what you've just said, really, is that there is so much to be agile for in this new era that we're in.
So I think two words that I've been hearing an awful lot in the last few years, which are hugely relevant here, and in essence, for me, really sum up what we're talking about in terms of sustainable business, are agility and resilience. And resilience is actually both organizational resilience, but it is also personal resilience. So one of the courses I do still teach at Cranfield is for our Masters in Sustainability program, which is a really exciting, innovative, virtually taught all online, apart from one spring school each year. And the people who are taking part are mainly following the modern apprenticeship level 7. And they're holding down very demanding full-time jobs alongside the studying that they're doing for their masters. And one of the things on the module which I teach, which is the final taught module of the program, Sustainability in Practice, one of the sessions that we have is a masterclass with a wonderful gentleman called Henry Majid from Mind Gym, my Mind Gym, about the importance of looking after your own personal resilience. And I think one of the positive things that's happened in the last few years has been the way that business leaders, including CEOs and very senior people, have been prepared to open up and talk about their own challenges with mental health, because we all know, I thought the statistic was that 1 in 4 of us during our adult lives would have some mental health challenges. I was chairing this conference the other day, as I said, where somebody from one of the mental health charities was saying, actually, we think it may be as much as 1 in 2, but whether it's 1 in 2 or 1 in 4, huge numbers of people. And so a willingness to talk about the topic and to think about what are the things practically that we can do, which is why I love the initiative that companies like Legal & General took to introduce mental health first aiders as something really practical, not imagining that people could substitute for professional help and so on, but that those mental health first aiders, rather like with conventional physical first aiders, could at least help to spot emerging problems and start to signpost people to help and so on.
Just thinking about the key drivers of corporate responsibility, I mean, you just mentioned agility and resilience, you've heard a lot of. Are there any others that you think will be prevalent in the next decade?
Well, I think systems thinking, no question about it. It's all too easy to get into our silos and not see the read across. So that kind of a mindset that looks for the connections and starts to spot those connections, really important. I think having a clarity about one's personal values, one's personal kind of ethical North Star, so that you can lead with integrity, is absolutely fundamental for all of this. And I think having that capacity to be able to engage and to be able to get insights from all parts of the organization that you're leading is so important. There's a great organization called Board Intelligence, and their founders talk about the value of collective intelligence. And I think collective intelligence isn't just something that is top down, but done well, it's absolutely bottom up as well. And it's how you as a leader can both create the kind of the tone from the top, the clarity about this is the purpose of the organization and the strategy that we're executing to try and achieve that purpose. And this is the kind of desired behaviors that we want in the organization. But it's also creating the culture where people are engaged and feel empowered, so they want to voluntarily give their ideas and suggestions. I've had the privilege of working with the Unipart group of companies for decades, and they are a brilliant example of really capturing the collective intelligence of their people and inspiring and motivating their people to go the extra mile for their customers, because they're just so relentlessly customer focused.
One of the things that's really emanated from you throughout this interview is that you are so passionate and highly motivated. And I'm sitting here wondering, how do you stay so motivated and inspired to continue your work? Because it's in the face of really quite significant adversity, isn't it? And this is an uphill struggle that often feels like pushing sand uphill, I think. So I just wondered, on a personal level, does it retreat back to that 11-year-old boy and everything he went through, or do you think it's more compounded by other things that you've been through?
Josh, great question. Great question. So I do get excited by going and seeing really great initiatives around the world, of being privileged to meet some really inspiring people and to learn from them. And I think ultimately you have to be optimistic, because the alternative is just so depressing and so scary, if that's not too glib or simplistic. Madeleine Albright, the late Madeleine Albright, who was President Clinton's Secretary of State, she had a wonderful phrase about, I'm an optimist, but I worry a lot. And I think that sums up the approach. Maybe more positively, and something which a friend of mine spotted, and we were having dinner in a restaurant in Malta years ago, and on this menu for this very fancy restaurant where the service was terrible, but on the menu card there was this wonderful quotation from Gandhi. I remember my friend who spotted the menu first said, "You're going to love this," and the quote from Gandhi was, "Live as though you will die tomorrow. Learn as though you will live forever." And I just love that idea of learn as though you will live forever, and carry on learning all the time.
Well, reflecting on that long career of learning, which I think, you've demonstrated through many awards and your publications, but what accomplishment are you most proud of when you think about maybe advancing corporate responsibility or with your IBE hat on? What are you most proud of?
I'm pleased that the tiny little idea that David Irwin and I and a few other folk in Newcastle had back in 1979 that became Project Northeast, but Project Northeast is still operating today, 45 years later. So and of course I can claim no kind of credit for any of that for the last 35 of those years. But I'm very pleased the P&E has become something of a model that people are able to learn from, both in this country and internationally. I'm pleased that the very first book that, my goodness, we sweated blood over to get out, called Everybody's Business, which had the subtitle Managing Risks and Opportunities in Today's Global Society, which Adrian Hodges and I did, and we published in 2001. I'm pleased to say had a foreword by the then Prince of Wales, now His Majesty King Charles. And that book emphasized that when we were talking about businesses taking responsibility for their social, environmental, and economic impacts, and by the way, we didn't anywhere in the book use either the TLA, the three-letter abbreviation of CSR, which was then the prevalent descriptor, nor corporate social responsibility. We just talked about the issues facing businesses today around the world, because there are some global forces of change in terms of revolutions of markets and technology and demographics and development and values. And we talked then about how businesses could respond to those global forces of change and the management issues that were emerging as a result. We kept on emphasizing, yes, this is partly about mitigating risks, but if you stop there, you are missing all of the excitement, all of the potential of all of the new business opportunities. And that idea that we first published in 2001 with Everybody's Business has been at the heart of what I've been doing ever since, saying to, whether it's a tiny little round table of business people or a student class, or to management conferences in different parts of the world, this is about managing risks, but also opportunities. And that, I think, is the thing that I'm most, obviously it's not just me, people like Peter Drucker, the great management guru, were talking about that years earlier. But I think in the context of corporate sustainability and responsible business, that emphasis on opportunity has been something that I've tried to consistently make for a quarter of a century, along with many other people.
And still so relevant 24 years later. Unbelievable, really. Oh, I've so loved our conversation, really enjoyed it. But our time's coming to an end. I had one last question, which I'm asking everyone. If you don't mind, David. If you could create a leader's survival kit, what would you put in it?
Now, this one you did give me advance notice of, and I have been struggling to think about this, Sarah. So first off would be a kind of because I like to have kind of symbols and things. So the first one would be an empty bottle of aspirin, and that would remind me, and hopefully by telling the story, it would remind the recipients of this survivors toolkit. I had a wonderful executive assistant, Denise Carhill, in the 1990s. Denise was fabulous. And whenever I was getting a bit too kind of short-tempered or unreasonable or demanding, she would not say anything. She would just disappear for a few moments and come back with a glass of water and take out an aspirin from the aspirin bottle and put it down beside me and walk away. And I would have to think, oh, sugar, what have I said? What have I just done? Did I say something to her, or did I say something to somebody else that she thought was out of order, or what have you? And I, would think and would work out and would apologize to whoever I had to apologize to. So I think that, and it was, Denise was the most wonderful person. I couldn't have achieved things without Denise. But having that reminder about keeping a sense of proportion and balance, because one of the challenges, I think, and I'm very guilty of this for much of my career, if you are passionate about something, if you believe that something you're doing is worthwhile and you're trying to make progress, it is very easy to get so focused on the mission and not think about how you achieve the mission. And this is a lesson I've learned the hard way by getting it wrong so many times over my career. I say that not with any sense of pride at all. On the contrary, of it's taken me a long, long time, and it's still a work in progress. So I think that will be the first thing in the survival kit. Don't sort of imagine that what you're asking, because somebody may be having trouble at home, may be worried about one of their kids, or may have issues in terms of caring for an elderly relative, that means that they're just not on the same page as you are at that point. And so that will be an important part of the survivor's kit. And I think I would also have, I'm not sure it exists, but it should exist, a collection of the best writings of Charles Handley and Peter Drucker, because what they wrote over their lives, both of them, there was just so much common sense that's still relevant for today. Peter Drucker, of course, passed in 2009. Charles just a few weeks ago, very sadly. But both remarkable, practical management thinkers. And so I would have those two things as a kind of as a reminder of how things to do well. And the third thing and the final thing I put in your survivors toolkit would be a picture frame, so that the leader can put in a photograph of whoever is most important to them in their lives, in terms of family, to remind them of a sense of proportion.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I particularly like the last one, because I think we can all lose sight of the people who are really important to us. Yeah, very poignant. Thank you very much, David, for your time. Absolutely wonderful.
Great question, Sarah. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Insights from the Coalface, Elevating Leadership Beyond the Boardroom. I hope this conversation left you with fresh insights, new perspectives, and a deeper connection to the challenges and opportunities of leadership. If you found value in today's discussion, I'd love for you to share it with your network, leave a review, or reach out to me with your thoughts. Leadership can be a lonely road, but it doesn't have to be. Let's keep learning, growing, and supporting each other. Until next time, stay resilient, stay authentic, and keep leading with purpose.